Hi, and welcome to episode 9 of the Pick and Pop podcast. Today, our guest is a true legend of British basketball coaching. In a career spanning over 4 decades at the highest levels of the game, his influence on past and present players and coaches is immense. A true coach's coach and someone that has been at the forefront of coach education and development in the UK. Please welcome Coach Mark Dunning.
Hey there, Tony. Thanks for having me. Let's shoot the breeze a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, in full disclosure to the people listening, you've not only influenced so many coaches, so many players, but you were literally, there from the first day that I started coaching. Not quite, but literally within the first year or so. And have been my mentor, for over 30 years now, and friend. And obviously that, I have so much respect and understanding of what your background has been. But I think we really need to explain to the viewers and to the people that listen, exactly, how you got involved in coaching and where this passion and love of the game of basketball came from, and how that influences and it inspires other people that you have met, throughout your career. So I think that the first question, of course, comes, like I always do, how did you get involved in basketball? And then how did that filter? Because I know it was pretty quickly how it filters into your first coaching experiences.
Well, I appreciate all the kind words, Coach. I first got involved. I didn't know that I wanted to be what I turned into being in terms of coaching. I just knew that I loved the game already at that point, and I had a passion for being involved in it and being surrounded by it already. So that was my first. So to answer your question, then when I got to college, I was already playing for local league teams in West London.
Sure.
So there was a slight kind of overlap when I was at college to ending up coaching one of those local league teams. Now, you'll know this, but the leagues in and around London at that time, Middlesex League, London League, Capital League in particular, and there'll be folks listening to this who can, reminisce about those times. Coach, the standard was off the charts because there was only one league, semi-pro at that time.
Yeah.
The other leagues weren't really what we think of today as the NBL. So these London leagues, were kind of the next level of basketball. And I'm telling you, the standard of players, some of the coaches that were coaching in those leagues, again, was awesome for me, because here I was, I didn't really have a clue what I was doing, but I knew that I loved the game. I had a passion for the game, and that kind of, filtered through to the players and the admin of this club. And they thought, would you like to coach? So I said, yeah. So we were all over the place in those leagues. We played in all 3, plus college. Man, it was unbelievable.
Right.
Luckily I had just a little bit of time that I was able to devote to my degree. I was at a teacher training college, as you know, and was training to be a PE teacher, which I ended up doing. But to bring it back to the coaching journey, my final year at college, the lecturer who was our coach, and we'd won the British College Championships the year before, so we had a really good team, everybody coming back, no coach.
Right.
So the guys asked myself and another guy, would we be player coaches? Because we couldn't let that team go down the tubes. It was too good. Right. And we were the defending champs. So we said yes. And again, that took it to a slightly next step as well for me in terms of, the coaching and seeing, I'm actually getting interested in this now. Right. So that was you alluded to the college situation. So that was the story.
Right. Okay. And then what was this next stage where you went to, kind of like a more kind of structured coaching type role? what was the first, time that you got into like either a club or, obviously we're going to talk about, the Crystal Palace kind of what that story is from there. What was that? What was that next stage?
Well, I mentioned the local league club that I was involved in was called the Greenford Cardinals, and at that time, we were we were a pretty good team, and we had aspirations of kind of moving. These days it would call sort of moving up to the national leagues through that. In those days, it wasn't quite like that, but we had some really good players, and it was partly there was a link between my college, which was St Mary's College in Twickenham, and the Greenford Cardinals, and as you'll find out in a few minutes, Crystal Palace. So I was their head coach at that time. We were doing really well. We had some really good players, but I was able to kind of, bring some ringers in to some of our teams and dress some of those guys. We had people like Richie Rudd, Phil Spires, guys from Crystal Palace, Clive Hartley. These were England internationals, and I was able to suit them up for this rinky-dink local league team. And we'd show up to all the places around London, and they were like, "These guys are ringers. Show me your registration cards," and all that stuff. Because of course these were known players around the league, the London area, and the country. So of course, I had to step up my game a little bit. But then at that point, I was realizing I was just about to graduate and take up my teaching job, which was in West London also. And I realized that, I want to do this coaching thing. But I don't want to mess around at this local league level anymore. Because, of course, at this time also, I was getting more and more immersed in the game per se. And, trying to get information from the States. And of course, you were reliant upon somebody sending you a book or something, or clinic notes or something. Anyway, luckily at college, of course, we had an extensive library. And of course, being a teacher training college and a PE college, I mean, we were with Loughborough and Borough Road at the time. St Mary's was kind of in that little cluster of well-known PE establishments. So the section of the library for sport and phys ed was awesome. So of course there was loads of basketball books there. Man, I'm in there photocopying all the sheets and bringing them home to study the plays and everything. So I got really into it. Anyway, here comes my first sort of quote big time situation, and Crystal Palace was, the perennial champion at that point, the #1 team in the country. And it was within sort of driving distance for me. Two of our players at college were already involved in the Crystal Palace organization. And I went up to basically, and also just a quick little anecdote, Jimmy Guyman and Mark Sayers, who were their Americans before I'd left college. So we're talking late 70s here. They used to come and work out at St Mary's because, as you know, back in those days, it was even worse than it is today with access to practice courts. So, of course, we were a college. During the day, a lot of the sports hall time, it was empty. They found that out. It was a short hop from where they were living, because they were living in Surrey. They'd come and work out on their own in the gym. And that was my first. Of course, I'd walk by in between lectures and I hear balls bouncing and I'm like, let me have a look in the window. I see them for the very first time. I didn't know who they were. Of course, as the weeks and months went on, we found out who they were. A few of us players started interacting with them. And if we didn't have a lecture, we'd lace them up and go and work out with them.
Awesome.
And so these two were obviously two of the, even today, some of the guys in my age would tell you that they're two of the best Americans that have ever played here, ever. So we're talking whatever, 40 years ago or however old I am. Anyway, so that was that again. It was another link which I didn't realize at the time was going to help me. So anyway, I went up to this guy, this player, Richie Rudd. People will know Richie. And I said, look, I need you to introduce me to the folks at Crystal Palace. I want to be on the coaching staff. So to cut a long story short, he facilitated that during the summer of, I want to say 79. I'm a bit sketchy on the dates. Anyway, I went up to the then owners, Terry Doherty and David Last, and I basically said to them, and I always quote this because it is true. I said, I'm going to be your assistant coach next season. Not please, not can I be, I'm going to be. And now, to my astonishment, they said, oh, okay. So I show up, back end of the summer preparing for pre-season, and the head coach, they just hired, Tom Wiseman had just left, Tom, and they'd hired Bill Sweek and Danny Palmer. Bill Sweek as the head coach. He played at UCLA for John Wooden. Yeah. I've got stories about Bill Sweek. It's not for today, but he was the head coach. Anyway, within, I want to say, into pre-season or training camp, he didn't even make it to the regular season. Right. He got an offer to go and coach in France, I think, or Germany, and off he went, which left Danny Palmer as the head coach and me as the first assistant.
Wow, unbelievable!
So that I was a rookie coach. I'd just taken up a teaching position, and here I was, and I was going to be the assistant to Danny, and I knew Roy before I got to Crystal Palace, but Roy Packham, the legend that he is, was obviously the incredible junior coach at that time. Yeah. And he wanted me as his assistant as well. So I did both.
Coach, at this time, do you have like some early thoughts on your philosophy, or are you just, sponging up? Are you drill based? Are you doing lots of competitive stuff in practice? What were you doing? Because of course, when you now get to Crystal Palace and it's a different level, it's Danny Palmer with the pros and Roy with the juniors who we'll talk about that now. But where were you at this moment in your kind of coaching philosophy type base? What were you thinking at that time?
Well, the fact that I was on the #1 team in the nation, we had unbelievable talent at the junior level, which obviously people know, and that went on for a number of years after that. And we had some of the best pro players in the country. So I'm like, I'm going to have to step up my game here, because you need to, and we can go obviously into this in a bit more detail later. You have to somehow gain respect of the players. And for me, there's really, certainly at that time, a couple of ways that I felt that I could do that. One, by acquiring as much knowledge as I could so that I can translate that to the floor and not look like a doofus out there, even though I was completely out of my depth. And the second way was to obviously show that you were prepared to go and learn stuff from them, from the coaches, extraneous things, which I was doing, of course, by this time, trying to network and get information. So that was a kind of an initial challenge for me, and I had to really step it up. But in terms of my philosophy, I didn't have one, right, because I was just really going on a lead from Danny with the seniors and Roy with the juniors. And again, because I had already been a bit of a head coach, albeit a way lower level to this, I was kind of really drawing on that experience. So as with a lot of young coaches when they start out, what are you doing? You're tending to work as a coach on the experiences you had as a player.
Right.
So you went through drills as a player, so inevitably you're going to replicate those, but now you're running them as the coach. So that was kind of what I was relying on at the time. But obviously Danny, he was, at first, he was one of those guys that wouldn't use his assistants. And I've told you this story many times. And it got to like the end of the first year, and I was kind of soaking everything up like a sponge. And I went to Danny. I said, look, you know, you need to give me a bit more responsibility in terms of actually practical coaching. Because, you know, I'm trekking across London here, you know, 5 times a week, plus my teaching job. You know, this is no joke. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it properly. So that must have been a bit of a wake-up call for him. And he's like, sure, fantastic, let's do it. And he gave me loads of responsibility after that. And, you know, so my knees were knocking, you know, when I had to take a drill down one end with people like Greg McRae, Mike Spade, God rest his soul, Big Joe. You know, he gave me the big guys to work on post moves, you know, stuff like that. But of course, it was awesome. I loved it.
I've got some real important questions here to ask, which most people won't know. But I mean, the first question I ask is this: is that you say that coaches, you know, come in and you know they're going to rely on their own experiences and stuff. But the people and players and the coaches that know you, I've gone on record pretty much every single time saying, you know, you were the most organized, you know, detailed coach, you know, maybe we've ever had here in the UK. It was just on another world, not another level, another world. Where did you gain that? And that had to that had to be just there had to be some innate stuff there, and you must have had that from the start. Because you know, like even today to today, you have this, you know, the details, the practice plans, everything is organized. So where were you getting that from? That's my first question.
I think you're right in using the word innate, even though I guess that could be debated a little bit. I put it down to 2 things. One, being at boarding school, you had to be, I don't want to say regimented, but you know, there was a lot of discipline around your life for 7 years. So you couldn't mess up on anything. You know, it was not quite like being in the army where they come and measure, you know, whether the fold on your bed sheet was a certain, no, not quite like that. But I think I gained a lot of sort of attention to detail and fastidiousness there. Then really becoming a teacher, you tend to be especially PE teachers tend to be a little bit more organized anyway than most, because you're going to have to, you know, run drills. You're going to have to get the kids in line outside the gym, you know, whatever it might be. So there was all those type of things must have influenced me without, it was kind of a subliminal thing.
Sure.
And when I came to my coaching, I knew that the attention to detail for me was going to stand me in good stead. So writing everything down was kind of second nature to me. And I was doing that from when I started coaching at the Greenford Cardinals. You know, I planned my practices and I kept those, you know, A4 sheets of paper for many, many years in my garage. In fact, I had, you know, reams and reams of, you know, practice plans. I don't know why I even kept them. I got rid of them, you know, one day. I just threw them.
I still have mine.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it came from, because I'll tell you right now, and God love him, Danny didn't give me that because he was a bit of a scatterbrain when it came to that sort of thing. Roy was a lot better in terms of, you know, the organizational aspects. So I was picking up these things, I think, from those sources to answer your question.
Yeah, and I want to make this point to the younger coaches that listen. I mean, you know, if you have not played at the highest level or even at a very strong level, you know, I feel that and we get asked this, you know, both of us all the time about, you know, how did we get into coaching and what did we do differently and stuff, as, you know, a quote, you know, non-high level players. You know, and the bottom line is that if you do not have a high level playing background, you better be the most prepared person in that gym. You know, it's as simple as that. Players better talk about you been the most prepared, because that's where you talk about that respect aspect. And if you don't gain the respect, oh, you know, you played for England, or you played in this National League team or this professional team, you know, you must be known as someone that is a high level basketball person. And I think that is such an important point. And
it's a great point.
Going on from that point, and I think this is a real key one. Unfortunately, most of the younger people won't know this, but talk to me about Crystal Palace. I want to just say, firstly, many people have heard me say this, you know, a true, not just, you know, potentially the biggest, best, you know, the best club that's ever been in existence in UK basketball. Certainly, you know, as a whole, with, you know, men, women, junior teams. Talk to me about, you know, the number of coaches and the coaches around you at that time, because you can start naming the names, and these are a who's who of great British coaches or legends in British basketball coaching. Was that a catalyst? Was that competition? Was that driving you?
Again, another good question. I think back to those times, and you're absolutely right in terms of that was a pool of ready-made players that you could learn from, because these were some of the best players in the country, by the way, including the women's team.
Absolutely.
You know, I could name some of the women on that, and you know, they're the legends of the game. So they were there playing, and we were a true club at that time, because of course Crystal Palace, the actual facility, was a unique place as well, with 4 courts already back in the 70s. So our practice sessions would always overlap between the 3 or 4 teams. So there was constant interaction. You could either watch and or work with and or talk to some of the best players, and of course all their coaches right there. Yep. So of course that was a big influence for me. And like you said, just to go back a little bit about the, you know, I didn't have a great playing background, so how was I going to get the respect of the players, etc.? And you and I have talked about this many years ago, when some of the ex-NBA players started to make little tracks into coaching, and they're like, you know, yeah, they were great players, but they didn't succeed as coaches. And of course, the corollary, the corollary is, here comes guys like me, and there's all loads of us around the country, weren't great players, but just had a love of coaching and or a teaching background, which gave us a foundation of, listen, we want to help people, never mind players and athletes, get better in life. And sport, of course, for us, it's basketball, was a fantastic vehicle to making that happen. So that's at a very basic level, without even getting technical about, you know, your knowledge of the game and the technical knowledge that you need in order to translate onto the floor to make these players and teams better. So I think that was all wrapped up then, and I was totally immersed in the whole, you know, pedagogical journey.
You know, were you you know, sponging? Were you exchanging ideas with, you know, like Jimmy Rogers and Mark Clark, and one was there a little bit?
I know you wanted me to name those 2 guys. You know, because Jimmy, I was there with Danny on my own for the first year, and then Jimmy came on second year and third year that I was there for. So of course, you know, now there's 2 of us, 2 assistants, going through the grind, and, you know, of course, we're all bouncing ideas off each other. You're talking hoops, etc. I got Roy with his vast, you know, knowledge with the juniors. We started a cadet team. I forget who the coach was. I think he was an American, actually, who coached, I want to say he coached the women's team for a while and the cadet men. Anyway, I forget his name. Mark can tell you. Of course, he comes in. That's another coach. Mark Clark then, you know, starts coaching a little bit later with the women's team. There's another coach. So yes, it was a rich environment for just getting immersed in hoops. And of course, you know what I'm going to touch on next. Here comes the WICB tournament. Now that had, and you know these stories, that had a profound effect on what was going to become my future pro coaching career.
Right.
So I know that's a question you got for later on.
In what way would you say that had a profound effect? Just because you were so inspired by, you know, this high level pro, you know, watching European teams, watching the American, you know, athletes in action, all of those other teams, the North Carolinas come back over. What was that the reasoning? What was, because obviously exactly the same for me as well, you know.
Yeah, all of that, all of what you just said, but here's the most important bit for that, for me, making the coaching contacts that I made.
Wow. Right.
Yeah. And that was the most awesome thing for me. Now that whole tournament, and I know, you know, Sam Nita he keeps hearing about the WICB and wants to do a whole podcast about that alone, because it's just such an awesome thing that everybody brings up. But for me, it was those two things. Yeah.
Can not quickly, but because I want to go in depth in this. So at this time, when was your first trip to the USA? And, you know, where did you go? Who did you meet? And then subsequently, I'm assuming that you went every single year from pretty much a whole series of years.
Yeah. Well, the thirst and the desire for the acquisition of knowledge that I alluded to earlier, and that you alluded to as well, led me basically to make biannual trips to the United States. And that started, I'd already been to the States kind of as a tourist. And actually went to a game at the old Philadelphia Spectrum, where I watched Dr. J, Moses Malone, Maurice Cheeks, that team versus the Chicago Bulls. Wow. So that was I think in 1978 or something like that. Anyway, but with the contacts I made at the WICB, this was in the early 80s now, so I want to say 81, 2, 3. Those were the main years for me. Building these contacts, because obviously these guys came back every year, as you know, to the WICB. Not always the same coaches, but one or two that came back all the time. So, of course, you renew those acquaintances. Back in those days, it was snail mail. I always kept in touch with them via letter and even, you know, transatlantic phone calls. But my two trips to the US every year basically went on for about another 10 years after that, non-stop. And I was very lucky where, and I know you want to get to this later, I met a couple of people in particular who helped me on my way. But basically the biannual trips were the Final Four, the NCAA Final Four in the spring, and which of course involved, as you know, the NABC coaches convention and related events. So again, coaching 24/7, and then in the summer, basically, don't forget I was still teaching, so I had to wait till the last day of summer term, but I was on the plane that night to work 5 or 6 weeks straight of summer camps, anywhere and everywhere. And again, I know you want to get to this later on. So you can imagine how I was now building basically my career, let alone as I said, the thirst for the acquisition of knowledge was just never quenched for me.
So
it was awesome.
Can you remember the first camp you went to?
That's a great question. Wow. You got me on the spot now, Coach. No. I went to so many.
Yeah.
A lot of them overlapped. I mean, you've seen my list of camps that I've worked at. East Coast, West Coast, and all points in between. Yeah.
Okay. So now, because we've got to skip some time and stuff, we're talking about, you're developing, where were you starting to develop your philosophy, because, as a coach, you were known as, not just the detail, but, you were hard-nosed defensively, multi defenses, where were you gaining that philosophy from? Who were your biggest influences as a young coach at that time?
Right. I mean, Danny Palmer was big on the defensive side of things. Plus, Roy, was, I mean, that was his main deal for those kids.
Yeah.
That and the fundamentals. So for me, it was just osmosis. And also at this time, I was also doing a lot of reading as much as I could. And, reading stuff by Bobby Knight, Dean Smith, and that, in those early days started to influence how I saw the game.
Yeah.
And again, because this one guy who I'll mention his name later when we talk about, I know you want to talk more about the USA thing. This one guy that I met via the WICB also started influencing me at the defensive end of the court. So that became my passion and mantra. Now, let me rewind several years. As a player, even though I hadn't played at a great level, I wasn't a great offensive player. I mean, I couldn't shoot, but I could really pass the ball. But one of my main things that I found out early as a player that would keep me on the court was to put out at the defensive end. So I was already kind of, gung-ho about defense. So that, again, via osmosis became the bedrock of my philosophy.
Yeah.
Now, when Roy left, before I left Crystal Palace, I took over being the head coach of the junior team. Our talent coach was off the charts. I mean, you had some unbelievable junior teams at Hackney and at London Towers. Mine were probably better than yours in terms of talent.
Sure.
Incredible. So I let these guys loose.
Yeah.
I would never run up the score. You know me long enough I've said that to you, from day one when I started, mentoring you a little bit. I would never do that to another coach, but we were so good. We couldn't help but blow teams up by 30. I mean, we got to the point, teams couldn't get it over. You hear about the phrase, they couldn't even get it over the half. Geez, they couldn't even get it past three-quarter court against us, never mind a half. We'd fall back into a zone. I would tell people not to close out. We'd play our bench for the whole of the second, things like this. So as not to embarrass you, that's how good we were. Yeah. We had, we were only allowed to dress 10 in those days. In the warm-ups, we had 8.5 guys that could dunk. The other team down the other end's looking down. They had maybe one guy. We were intimidated. So I'm getting to this point. I was able to experiment with those great athletes and those kids. Of course, they'd run through a brick wall for you. And it was all about the defense, baby. Yeah. So that's where I started. Right. But of course, it wasn't only just rah-rah and, here's how we're going to do it. I was totally immersed in the teaching of it and how to do the things the right way.
Sure.
And then I started becoming super detailed oriented. And that alludes back to some of the things that you said quite kindly again about me and how people know me and, back how my teams used to play.
So from Palace, really quickly, what's the route to Thames Valley Tigers as the first professional job?
Well, actually, go back a bit to that. My first head coaching job at the sort of semi-pro level was, don't forget, there was only 2 leagues, NBL 1, which was the precursor to the Pro League, and NBL 2. So I took a job in NBL 2 at Brunel Uxbridge.
Yeah. That's right,
and that was my first head coaching job. 2 Americans, really good players, fantastic guys, and some really good English players. So again, we had quite a bit of success there, coach, in my first year. We won the National Cup, and we also got promoted in my first year of being a head coach to the next level. And again, I was able to now, you know, I was going up against some quite well-known coaches in the league by that time. And of course, your very first guest, I love him, Curtis Xavier. You know, he would have been a player in that league at that time with a bunch of other guys at Calderdale and what have you. So, you know, the competition was good. Teams were, as I say, semi-pro. I mean, we had 2 Americans, and we had at least 2 or 3 top English players who were getting, you know, back in those days, expenses, which was a big deal. You know, people had day jobs, but if you were going to play at a high level, you were still able to get some expenses, which was in lieu of salary, which came later on for the English guys. So that was my first head coach's position. You know, that was with senior men, of course. So that's where I wanted to be. I knew that's where I wanted to be. I was still teaching at the time. I knew I didn't want to make teaching my career. And I was looking for now real opportunities to see, you know, how could I become a full-time pro coach? That's what I wanted to do. And I was again very lucky to get a break. I'd done quite well at Brunel. Now there's a story behind that. I won't go into it, but I actually left there because they didn't really have aspirations of going to the next level. It was partly financial. There's a bunch of other stories around it. But anyway, to sort of get to the next stage, Brian Naismith, who was the owner of the Bracknell Pirates, as they were known at that time, he was a guy that I'd met when I was at school. Now, this is another story. I covered it with Sam on the Hoops Fix podcast. But it was a very fortuitous meeting because later on, I kept in touch with Brian. And by the way, again, to go back, he and I started the original Coaches Association. Yeah, so I knew Brian, you know, off the floor. I knew him via basketball from back at school. And he'd seen how well I'd done at Brunel and basically offered me the head coach's job now at the top level with the Bracknell Pirates, who eventually became the Thames Valley Tigers. And then obviously you've had Coach James on. He told you the story of where they went from there. Yeah.
I think it's super important, okay, that, you know, in this period, and we are missing a lot. I mean,
we are.
You know, like with the problem being is that with these podcasts, we can go, you know, so much in the history, especially with the legends. There's so much to cover. But, you know, I want to get, you know, to this stage where we're talking about the USA and the contacts you made there, because I think it's so important that there must have been at this time, you are going, like you said, 2 times a year, and just talk about some of the names that you're starting to befriend at this time, because I think it's super important, and I'll explain to the audience why when you start talking about it.
Well, we'd already talked about some of the influences that I'd had early on around the Crystal Palace, you know, bubble. And that started to influence my coaching philosophy very early on, as we spoke about a little bit there. But also my influence started to become when I went, you know, started going to the States. My first Final Four was in 1982, you know, when MJ hit the shot, all of that stuff. And then I proceeded to go to 10 more, including 9 in a row. And I also actually took, God rest his soul, Jimmy Rogers to his very first Final Four the following year, which was, I believe, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1983, when, you know, the miracle shot NC State with the late Jim Valvano, who I was lucky enough to meet down the road.
you were able to get tickets to go into the game at this time?
Coach, listen, this is a whole new different topic that you might want to go. Back in those days, it wasn't the media massive billion-dollar industry that it became.
No.
So what I did, and again, I joined via snail mail and everything else, the Coaches Association in America. It's called the NABC, National Association of Basketball Coaches. And I befriended, and this is, you know these stories, I befriended the CEO, a guy called Joe Van Sisson. Now, you know, this was all part of my, you know, cunning plan to ingratiate myself into all these contacts that we're about to talk about. Because I just knew I had to put myself, you know, and just become a pain in the butt to further my career. And that's what I ended up doing. So I became a member of the NABC, and via the NABC, unbelievably in those days, an international coach was able to get a ticket to the game. And by the way, coach, in those first 2 or 3 years, they weren't in the domes. So you didn't have 50,000 people wanting to get to the game. They were in the arenas. So you might have, you know, at Albuquerque, the Pit, as it's known, you know, I think it was 16,000. Right. Intimate setting, looked like a proper college game. And unbelievably, the coaches were seated like 4 rows back from the court in those days. Forget it. Later on, you were lucky to get a ticket in nosebleeds, you know, even as a member. So, anyway, I could go in. That's another story.
Another story, yeah. So the contacts,
So I started to obviously go to the Final Fours and started attending the clinics. Now, whenever somebody would speak, I'm in line when they finished to chat with them and get their details, so I could keep in touch with them and write to them. Now, these were big time coaches, because in those days, you know, the guys weren't the media personalities that they ended up being. These were humble guys who, even if you were getting ready and preparing for a Final Four game, they still came and talked at the clinics and would meet you afterwards with no problem. So, of course, here I am going up to Dean Smith, shaking his hand and saying, "Coach, I'm introducing myself." But, of course, with Dean, we had a little connection, Steve Bucknell. So, of course, there was a little affinity going on there. He'd already brought a team to the WICB. I don't want to say I knew him, but listen, he would be a guy who would say, "Oh, yeah, I know you from London." Yeah, awesome. It started. I mean, I'm going to drop quite a few big-time names, Coach. I hope you don't mind. But, of course, all this time, I'm learning. One of my people, and I want to mention this guy's name because he basically got me going. I'd said to you, I'd met some people at the WICB that had an unbelievable influence on me for the rest of my life, including to this day, by the way. A guy called Jim White. You've heard me speak about him. He's still one of my best friends to this day. In 1981, I met him. He was a player agent out of LA. But he was also a junior college coach, very well known in Southern California, but in the whole state of California, because he was unbelievably successful at that level. He played at USC. He was an assistant at USC before he became a head coach. Listen, this guy knew everybody, but he also had a lot to share with me about coaching. And I'll give you a quick snippet. He watched me coach at Crystal Palace, for example, and would critique me, you know, at dinner at night. And of course, that was great because here's a guy I kind of was already looking up to as somebody who had superior knowledge to me. Anyway, he taught me things like, I'll give you a quick example. He was defensively oriented. He saw I was. He saw my passion on the sidelines. He was drawn to me a little bit because he saw him in me as a little bit. So we had this kind of click. We clicked straight away. And he taught me stuff like, and you know, you and I worked on this when we worked together on the floor. Things like playing full court man-for-man defense, but not guarding the inbounder and playing 5-on-4 in the court. things like this.
Sure.
You know, so I brought that back, started experimenting with it. That's just one example. But here's the point. He introduced me. He would be at some of the Final Fours, not all, because obviously as an agent, he had an interest in being there. And, you know, of course, you know, one of my famous stories of he was John Stockton's first agent. And, of course, I hung out with Stock for a summer and worked him out a little bit and all this sort of stuff through Jim.
Yeah.
But Jim would come to some of the Final Fours, and because he knew everybody, and he was a kind of not a legend in Southern California, but people knew him. He would see Bobby Knight over the other side of the convention hall and say, "Hey, you want to meet somebody?" And he'd walk me over to Coach Knight and introduce me to him.
Unbelievable.
That's just two names already. Dean Smith, you know, Pete Newell. Now, you know my story about Pete Newell. Maybe we'll get onto this later. But he's one of the all-time coaching legends in the, you know, since James Naismith hung the peach basket up. And of course, Jim knew him. He'd introduced me to Pete Newell, which transformed itself into me being able to say to, or ask Pete Newell to come and work on his exclusive camp. It's called the Pete Newell Big Man Camp. Listen, nobody got into that gym.
No.
Let alone on the floor with these players. I can come on to that later on. So I know you wanted to know about all these things. At that time, you know, he introduced me to, yeah.
So, I mean, the question that everyone's going to ask is, you know, and you know that we've discussed this before, but, you know, with this type of contact, you know, with Jim White specifically, why did you not make the decision to go and coach in America?
Ooh, Coach, I thought that was coming later on when you ask every guest, what are some of your coaching regrets?
Yeah.
Can I leave it for then?
But yeah, I mean, you know, it's an important one because, you know, you could just see, you know, so much of the stuff that's happening, you know.
Let me give you a quick answer.
Hmm.
I was on the rise here, and you know this story. I know you want it for the viewers. I was on the rise. I was a head coach at the pro level. We had a pretty good team. Bracknell was doing quite well. I was being looked at for the national team jobs, you know, seniors. And I wanted to progress as far as I could in this country.
Right.
So that was what was keeping me here.
Okay.
But I had some opportunities because in those days they had 3 assistants full-time in college, plus they had what they were allowed to have what they called a grad assistant. Now that changed over the years. I believe it might have come back again. I don't know. But that was basically a younger guy who was prepared to go to college, work on his master's. So you were a student, but you were attached to the coaching staff. You weren't going to get paid. You had to find your own way. And I had 2 or 3 opportunities to do that. And because I wanted to keep my rise here, I turned them down. And that was going to be at the end of this podcast when you asked me about regrets. Okay. That's going to be one of them.
Okay, we need to sum this up a little bit about the other. I mean, some of the most important people that you met along the, you know, the camp journey and stuff, not just the final 4. I mean, yeah. I mean, what about?
Let me give you hopefully a quick little history. Again, through Jim and other people I was meeting, of course, every one of these coaches I'd meet, college coaches, I'd ask, can I come and work your camp in the summer? And that's why, and you know my journey, and you've seen the list of camps I worked. You know, if I met Coach Smith, you know, damn sure one of my questions is, can I come and be on your staff in the summer camp? So multiply that by about 5 or 6 guys, and you can see how my summers were being filled easily, going from camp to camp. But of course, every camp you attended, you're meeting a bunch more coaches, you're making a bunch more contacts, and that leads you to even more either camp situations or visiting colleges. Like, again, you've seen my list of practices I've been to, and I've been lucky enough to, sit in with some, big time coaches. But the story the meat of the story is Tom Becker, who was an American coach coaching over here in those early 80s. He coached at Sunderland, became a really good friend of mine. Really good coach. Sunderland, by the way, beat Crystal Palace in one of those finals. I forget which one. So they were one of the few.
I was there.
You were there. There you go.
Yeah.
Tom was coaching. Randy Hefner was his assistant coach. And in your first podcast with Coach Xavier, he mentioned Randy. He'd gone to visit with him. So, of course, you befriend all these guys. We were on the phone all the time. I became really friendly with Tom. Tom and I, you mentioned Athletes in Action back at the WICB days. Now, one of the visiting teams also was a team called Marathon Oil, coached by a guy, legend in the whole world of basketball, Jim McGregor.
Right.
Great book. I think I gave it to you, called Call for Traveling. If people can still get a hold of that, you need to read it. Jim McGregor knew Tom already. So again, it's all this networking thing. He ran a camp at Long Beach State. It was an international coaches camp / player improvement camp for pro players from around the world. Jim McGregor, we could do a week-long podcast on his stories. But he was all for he was in the international scene when nobody else was at that time. Another guy, an American coach who Jim was responsible for placing, Dan Peterson, from Italy. He coached in Italy. Obviously, again, got to know him via the WICB. His teams came back a couple of times. Tom and I went to Jim's camp at Long Beach State. There was coaches and players from Belgium. That's another story. Two of the coaches who attended that camp were from Belgium. They ran the Belgium Coaches Association. So me, I'm on them. Yeah. And we ended up doing collaborations between our two associations. They'd send me their publication, which was in French or Flemish, and I'd send them the publications I was producing at the time, called Fast Break. So, of course, all these things were happening. Anyway, end of camp comes. Tom and I, we're kind of at a loose end. We're in Southern California. Do we go to the beach? Do we go to Disneyland? Let's just hang out for a while. We weren't ready to go home or anything. Two basketball junkies. There's only one thing to do. Let's find another camp to go to.
Right.
Phone call, my man, Jim White. Of course, he knows everybody. Jim, can you help us out? Have you got a camp we can visit? Snow Valley Basketball Camp, Montecito, Santa Barbara, California. Run by Herb Livesey and two other guys who I'll mention later on. Tom and I drive up the coast. We go to this camp. We get a warm welcome by Herb and the other guys who run the camp. A guy called Charlie Sands, who was another junior college coach in Los Angeles. Again, well-known guy, fantastic teacher of the game, really influenced a lot that I did in terms of drills. You mentioned drills earlier. That's where I got a bunch of my stuff, and you know the stories. And another guy called Cleet Adelman, Rick's brother, got me. And of course, this is all the links. Of course, Rick Adelman coached at Portland, coached at Houston, had a bunch of other stops in the league, was a well-known and well-respected coach. He, of course, would come visit his brother and visit the camp and also speak on it. So I got to know Rick. So we went to Snow Valley just as observers. So this must have been 82, 83, somewhere in there. Anyway, cut a long short, I hooked up with these three guys, kept in touch with them, and asked, could I come and work their camp the following summer? And of course, that was the beginning of my story, which you know well, about the Snow Valley basketball camp and the influence it had on me.
Right.
And of course, not only did I meet a whole bunch of people, including the Van Gundy family, Jack Ramsey. I could go through a lot of big time names. It might sound like name dropping to your audience, but you know, this is what you want to hear.
I mean, the just to sum this up, because you know we've still got quite a long way to go.
Yeah.
You know, the point being is that when you say the name dropping, there's name dropping to say, I'll give you another name drop for you. You know, when you were had still early influence, you were bringing over incredible people. One of the people that I remember is one of my, not the first clinic I went to, but it wasn't even a clinic. It was actually a night with Pat Riley in central London. I can't even remember where, but it was in some.
I remember
kind of,
it was at the Wembley Conference Centre.
Right. Okay. I can't even remember where it was, but I remember I went. It was Pat Riley. It was famous. You know, I met Pat Riley. I shook his hand. You know, if we had the ability to take a picture with a phone, I would have had a picture with him on my phone.
Exactly.
But that does not mean I know Pat Riley. Whereas you still converse with Stan and Jeff Van Gundy. You still converse with all of these high-level coaches, you know, because of your past, and that's the incredible connection that you have with legends of the game.
Let me give you the connection with all that, and again, it comes from Snow Valley and it comes from Jim White, because Jim White was also the co-owner of the LA Summer Pro League, which was the precursor to the NBA Summer League, which it is now. So, of course, Jim this was in the summer. The name gives it away. You know, you've got the NBA teams there, including, I mean, he introduced, by the way, at Snow Valley, I met Bill Burtker, who was the longtime LA Lakers assistant to not only Pat Riley, but to several, Phil Jackson, and, you know, a couple of the other coaches. I think he still might be in the back office as a consultant.
I think he is some sort of mini.
There you go. Yeah. So I met Bill and kept in touch with him. And he actually, and this is down the road a little bit, he was the guy that facilitated getting me into the Lakers practices, which I went to 2 times, including one of their preseason training camps. But of course, Jim knew Paul Westhead, who was coaching at Loyola Marymount at the time, which is where LA Summer League would be played. Yeah. So all these little connections, and of course, Pat Riley was Paul Westhead's first assistant on the Lakers. So I met all these guys at that time, and the clinic you're alluding to was way down the road, because it was it actually wasn't anything to do with coaching. Right. No, we were sponsored by Reebok. Right. So I had a link with Reebok International over here, and they were part sponsors of Amnesty International. Pat Riley was an ambassador for Amnesty International, and through all those links, we managed to get that coaching clinic set up, which you're talking about. So, but basically, this is where not only my basketball knowledge was accumulating, philosophy, getting bedded down, but I was meeting all these contacts, which were obviously standing me in great stead. Plus, with all this work, I was getting so many reps out on the floor. You know, you can imagine 5 odd weeks of back-to-back camps. You know, Jim managed to get me onto one of the Summer Pro League teams. It was one of the free agent teams. It wasn't one of the, I won't big time it and say it was an NBA team. But hey, you were playing against the NBA teams, and I was one of the assistants. So, you know, awesome.
Just for the younger coaches, yes, the LA Pro Summer League was the precursor to the NBA Summer League.
Absolutely. Exactly. And it was the only game in town in the summer. Yeah. You know,
talk to me a little bit about, So some of the important lessons you learned along, coaching lessons you learned along the way, how was this shaping some of your leadership style with your teams? Obviously, you coached at Bracknell. You then went on to a series of BBL teams, professional teams, had good success in a number of them. What were the lessons you were learning, and how was your leadership and coaching style, influenced by all of this?
Well, obviously it was getting influenced by everybody I was meeting. So I was having to cherry pick some of the things, that you were picking up along the way, including some of the styles I was seeing from all these, great coaches, some of them, not so great others. I mean, like I said to you, some of the biggest influences in terms of my technical ability were high school and junior college and NAIA level coaches who would come to mainly Snow Valley. They had the best teaching staff in the whole of the United States teaching now.
Yeah.
So I was rubbing shoulders with these guys, watching how they did things, and would basically literally copy them. And then I'd bring all that back to my teams and figure out what worked for me and them, i.e. the players,
Yeah.
and two, what I liked, what I was going to keep, what I was going to throw out. And of course, everything started to fall into place. I already knew my focus was going to be defensively. I knew that from an early stage, as I think we've already mentioned. But of course, all these other things, I was able to now just underline all the attention to detail that I already had within me. But I would see these coaches, fantastic teachers of the game, and look at the details and make notes. And, back in those days, that was all you relied on. And of course, you know what it's like at camp. You teach you'd be on the floor all day, and then here comes the evening. The coaches would scrimmage for an hour, go get a shower, then the real education starts.
Yeah.
Where you'd either have some camps wouldn't allow you out. You weren't allowed to go into the town or anything. Other camps you could go to the bar and have a few beers. But if you weren't allowed out in town, you getting pizzas and beers, and you'd be talking till 3 or 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
Just hoops.
Yeah.
And the notepad would be at the side of me, of course, in those times.
Yeah.
Because I'm just sponge. I'm a sponge. I'm soaking up all this incredible information. And it was the same at the Final Fours. There was more limited access to those coaches there than you had at summer camp. But it was still all information just coming my way, and I wanted it all, Coach. I wanted it all.
Obviously I'm bypassing, a lot of checkpoints along the way, but, just highlight some of the great moments, that you feel in your career, and then, just expand a little quickly on some of those regrets as well.
Well, I think, for me, the joy of seeing players improve, one of the highlights,
Right.
and especially sort of later on in my career, when you get a little bit older and wiser, and you've been doing it for quite a while, special moments like players coming back maybe years later and just saying, "Thank you, Coach, for everything you did for me."
Right.
Both as a player, but more importantly as a man, and just to help them maybe start off a little spark in them that they didn't think they had for a career-based situation. For example, becoming a teacher.
Sure.
That's just one quick example.
Yeah.
So that was always something that really gave me a lot of joy. Also, and again, this is happening more and more frequently, seeing some of my former players now have their offspring become you know, players, and in some cases quite good players.
Really good.
And that's a hoot for me.
Yeah.
You know, to see that. And I've had some nice moments where I've been in watching a couple of BBL games, and you know, these former players of mine, after the game, you know, we've got together and they bring their son over who has just played and said, "This is one of my first coaches." Yeah, and that's just fantastic. I love that.
Yeah.
It ages you a bit, but it's still awesome.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, in terms of success, I mean, you know, winning the National Cup and that promotion year in my very first year of being a head coach at the sort of big time level, if you want to call it that, you know, that was a highlight. Another highlight would be taking the only all English pro team to the Final Four in the BBL. Now, I know you want to fight me on that, saying that your Everton team was, but of course you had Nate.
Yeah.
Nate Ranking, so that doesn't count.
And Tafari Tony as well, yeah. So,
and Tafari, so that doesn't count.
No.
You were my assistant on that team, so
Yeah.
I think you can vouch for that.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a little bit of an asterisk against Solomon Ayinla, but we brought him into the fold as an Englishman for sure.
Yeah.
And then you know, regrets again. We touched on this earlier. I had a couple of opportunities to go. I won't mention the schools because they're actually big time schools. I've still got the letters today, from handwritten, of course, and typed on a typewriter, offering me these places to become a grad assistant. And you know, hey, who knows? Woulda, shoulda, coulda. You know, I don't know where I'd be today if I'd taken those up. But yeah, that was looking back, and you know, because you and I are so close, you know a lot about me. You know, looking back, I wish I'd kind of done it because of stuff that has happened to me along the way in our game over here.
Sure.
That, you know, I don't want to put a downer on my story, but
I think
yeah.
that in a slightly different time, or you know, even with a slightly different kind of decision making, you would have ended the least you would have ended up in is being, you know, in player personnel stroke, you know, GM management, which you could have done with your eyes closed. As a matter of fact, you possibly would have been like a next level GM type person because of your knowledge and, you know, your attention to detail, and I mean, that would have been very, very interesting. But of course, you know, those things not worth, you know, completely talking about now.
Who knows where that would have led to? But you know, because we've spoken about this before privately. If I'd done that, you know, I maybe would have ended up just being a high school head coach or something like that, and that would have been great because at least you could have earned money. Yeah. Versus coming back here, and we haven't gone through all the clubs I coached on for obvious time reasons. But you know, sure, I earned good money when I was at Thames Valley, you know, because I ended up being the head coach / GM. So you know, I was earning 2 salaries there. But my next stops, you know, down the road, it was just part-time rinky-dink money. Yeah. So, you know, even as a high school coach in the States, in fact, you know, at least you could have made it your quote unquote career, which you couldn't here. And that's what, you know, is lamentable for me. And I know, you know, you want to, if I haven't broken the internet with time, you know, and a lot of younger coaches who have been on my courses and everything have heard this from me anyway, you know, advice to coaches in this country.
Yeah.
You know what I'm going to say on that?
That's a great segue into, you know, your thoughts on, you know, you really are a cornerstone, you know, along with, you know, Coach Collins and Coach Tidmus and the number of people that were, you know, that have been involved. But you were a cornerstone of the BCA, of coach education. I mean, the amount of people, not just that have come on to the podcast, but I know personally, amount of coaches that say they were on, you know, Coach Dunning's level 2, Coach Dunning's level 3. We were at the coaches camp with Coach Collins and Coach Dunning, it's incredible the amount of coaches that you've touched, that you've influenced, that you've inspired. So your thoughts on, where we are, with British coaches, the fraternity, coach education, I mean, it's a big subject, but in 3 or 4 minutes, kind of give me your summary of all of that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Coach, it's me. I'm always, I've got a love of the game. Even to this day, I've got a passion for it, even though I'm not really that much involved. It's in me here. It will never die. And I like to think that enthusiasm has rubbed off on people along the way. And you mentioned it, that so many coaches have kind of come through my sphere of influence, and I'm happy for that, and I'm grateful for that as well. And to this day, I've still got 1 or 2 guys that still call and want a bit of advice or whatever, and that's fantastic. So, where we are, boy, oh boy, I mean, again, you've known me for so long, and unfortunately, the conversations we had 20, 25 years ago, still some of it applies today, and it's pessimistic. It's not good.
No.
And that really not only saddens me, but annoys me, because I lay it, and me, I'm going to call it like it is. I never sugarcoated anything to my players, and I won't do it to coaches. I lay it at the feet of the national governing body in all its various acronymic forms, EB, EBA, whatever you want to call them. They've done nothing or very little for coach development and education. And that's one of yours and my bugbears along the way. The BCA obviously tried to do a lot of that stuff, and I think we succeeded over many years. Coach Collins, myself, Coach Cadona, who you're going to have on soon, various other people who were in the administrative roles, as well as the sort of practical roles, i.e. doing on-court coaching, at clinics, running our summer camp, our residential level 3, which of course the alumni, reads like a who's who of coaching with guys who are active today. And you've had some of them already on the podcast.
Yeah.
So we try to move that forward, but we're met with various obstacles, which I won't get into. And that's the sad reality of where we are. And the worst indictment, even though the words came out of my mouth at all my level 3 courses, and you've heard me say this as well. And in fact, in a bizarre twist, you actually ended up taking this advice. God love you for it. I used to say to the young coaches, if you're really serious about your coaching career, about the coaching pathway you want to pursue, if you really want it bad, you have to leave this country, because you ain't getting it here. Because A, nobody gives a damn about you and your development, and B, there is no coaching pathway in this country where you can make it as a professional, both with a big P and a small p, so that you can earn a living out of it and run a family and everything else. And I used to say those things and think, geez, why do I have to say that? I'm in my own country. We should be able to take care of it here, as the Australians can, as the French can, as the et cetera, et cetera. You know the deal, Coach, with that. So, yeah, as far as the fraternity is concerned, we started trying to build that with the BCA, and I think we had it. We'd have these clinics running at least 4 or 5 times a year all over the country. It was like, we called it a roadshow. We took it on the road, and we made sure that every region of the country was taken care of with a coaches clinic. So we could, touch as many coaches as we could. And the fraternity started to happen. Guys were in touch with each other all the time. Guys were coming down from Birmingham to attend the London clinics, and you'd see the same folks everywhere. It was awesome, because that's what I was able to have. But where did I have it? In the United States. I had to make the transatlantic trips to get that. Because it exists over there, as you know. I don't have to tell you. You've been over there as well a lot, and you've experienced some of that fraternal thing with coaches. So have we got it here? No. Can we foster it? Yeah. What's it going to take? Question mark. I refer back to a previous podcast guest, Coach Veer. If you're listening, get the new BCA up and running.
Say, yeah.
Okay. Yep.
So, Coach, talking about coach education, I mean, you've been someone that, you know, potentially has run some of the most, you know, certainly at one stage you were running the most high-level courses. You were someone that I and myself and a number of coaches mirrored, you know, how you structured those courses. Because of course we weren't really being told how to structure the real level 3s and the level 2s. What's your thoughts on our coach education structure? Where do you think we're going wrong? Do you feel that we've now gone too far to European style, or what's your main thoughts on everything that's going on at this moment in coach education?
Obviously, it's a quite a broad subject when you frame it like that. But my first thought would be, particularly for still up and coming coaches, as you know, I've always said there's no substitute for actually getting on the court and doing stuff. That's probably the best education for coaches. And that message has rung true for certainly all the time I've been involved in. And I've preached it, as you know, on all the various coach education courses. However, that's easier said than done for some people. I mean, in this podcast, we've kind of got an inkling of my route that I took, which is kind of a bit of a traditional one in terms of, you know, coaching, starting out at low or junior levels, becoming an assistant coach at the high level, doing all the necessary CPD, hustling, you know, at these camps and making all the contacts that I did. I went the American route. Somebody like Coach Collins went more Euro route. And then eventually getting a head coach's position at the, well, for me, it was always going to have to be at the top level. That's where I wanted to be, and I'm thankful that I managed to get there. So that's kind of, in a way, a traditional route that I would still promote in a way. However, we've got this parallel thing with our coach award system, which, to be quite honest with you, even though I've been a tutor of those awards prolifically, along with a couple of, you know, colleagues, it's never sat well with me that it gives the people coming on it the necessary tools, and depending, of course, on who the tutor is, the necessary information to make them coaches. What it does, it gives them a qualification. To me, that's maybe a quarter of it. The other 3/4 is about knowledge, experience, getting on the court and doing it, making all the mistakes, but definitely working with players, putting the drills on the floor, being able to organize it, structure it, plan all your practices, all the stuff that, you know, we talk about all the time, and then having the intricate knowledge of all the details that are necessary within that framework to basically, what is our aim as coaches? To make players better. And if we're at the team level, certainly at the pro level, where there's the pressure on to win, then to make that situation better for ourselves and our players and our team. So for me, there was always that disconnect, because guys have gone away from our level 3, which was really the top level of award. I mean, the level 4 never really came to any fruition. Even, I mean, I don't want to get into the mechanics of all the UKCC and everything that came in, but let's face it, the level 3 was the kind of pinnacle, if you like. And I remember back in the day in the you know, England basketball tried to make it mandatory, for example, for all the head coaches in the BBL to have level 3. So all the Americans who had no coaching awards because they've come from a completely different structure of basketball coaching. They're laughing at it. And eventually the association gave it to them as a token to help them with their work permit application. It was a joke. So there was no translation there for me. People that went off our level 3 courses that we ran for 13 years in the summers. I ran them over weekends as well, all over the country. How many, as a percentage of those coaches, went on to coach at any decent level? Answer, I don't know. And yet you would have expected most of them to have. So even though I was enthusiastically tutoring those and promoting them and everything, I was never necessarily an advocate of the outcome of what those coach awards gave us. So, you know, if you look at the American system, they don't have formal coaching awards. It's about wins and losses, baby, and who you know. You know, if you've got a good track record at a lower level, you've got an opportunity to make it to the next level if you get through the interview, or if you happen to know one of the boosters who can help you, you know, and put a good word in for you. That's how it works. But the bottom line, if you lose, you don't necessarily advance up the coaching tree, and of course, the end result being you don't eat. In Europe, many of the countries have got rigorous. I mean, the French system, for example, is really tough. I remember I mentioned Coach Tom Becker earlier in the podcast. He ended up going from here after Sunderland to coach in the Pro A in France.
Sure.
He had to put his name down on the score sheet as the assistant coach for 2 years because he didn't have his French coaching license. And it was a degree level coach award, and he had to do it in French. So that's just one quick example.
I mean, kind of moving on from that, but at the same time, why do you think, and I'm not fully putting this on the governing body because I think it's in all areas of the sport, but why do you think that our sport has been so poor at keeping people like yourself, ridiculously high level basketball people, involved in some capacity, whether you are, you know, head of coaching, whether you are a GM, you know, head of scouting, something in some capacity, either with a professional team, with the governing body, with a regional body, with an academy. Why do you think that our sport is really poor at keeping our top, you know, older coaches or older experts involved in the game?
This is one of the our travesty topics of conversation, Coach. You and I have had it many times, and it's still a travesty today. And I've been out of the loop a little bit, as you know, for various reasons. But the answers I come up with are one, and we mentioned this earlier about the whole fraternity of coaching. We don't really have that as an ethos in the country. And the second thing is the governing body don't care. They just flat out don't care, because there is, and I'm speaking for myself, because as you know, I still love the game and I have a passion for it. But I'm speaking for a lot of other people as well, who we could name. Let's not do it today. They're sidelined, marginalized, use whatever words you want for whatever reason, I don't know. Yet the level of knowledge, expertise, and ability, and quite honestly, desire of these people to still want to contribute, still want to give back to the game, and still be able to have a very high level contribution is completely wasted. Completely wasted. And I haven't got an answer to that, because let's face it, the personnel at the governing body have changed over certainly the time you and I have been involved.
Sure.
And yet the attitudes and ethos that they come with regards to this specific topic still exists. And I've never been able to figure that one out. This would never happen in Spain or Italy, even places like Australia, who have obviously a really good coaching structure and coach development and education system over there. They utilize, their veteran coaches or coaches that, aren't necessarily involved with a team anymore. They put them as, use whatever words you want, consultants, mentors. They put them on the advisory boards of the national teams, things like this, where we, us, them, could make a little contribution to maybe the younger coaches coming through or whatever. And as you can see, I'm fired up about that, because what a waste. What a complete waste. In fact, when I've been in the, in the grey areas between jobs, or, now that I haven't been coaching for a while, people all over the place ask me, oh, why aren't you involved? You should be doing this, you should be. And I'm like, yeah, we're in England. That's why I'm not involved. Nobody cares.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Coach, let's wrap this up at the end of your game. Questions, 4 questions. Always the hardest one to start with. Your favorite player to coach?
Always a tough one on your podcasts. I've got a little list here, in no particular order. Peter Scantlebury,
Awesome.
Sam Stiller, although he drove me crazy for 2 years, but I still love the guy, and he, as a player, he was great for me. Michael Hales, who'd run through a brick wall for me. Roger Huggins, who, well, I have a real soft spot for Roger because I helped him in his early development and was absolutely thrilled with the way he turned out as a player, as a professional, as a husband and father. And then finally, Ray Schultz, who was one of my American players at Hemel Hempstead. Yeah. So that's my list.
Awesome. That's a great list, covering quite a lot of years as well. What about favorite all-time basketball coach?
Has to be Mike Krzyzewski, John Wooden, and I'll throw one other name, Greg Popovich.
Okay, awesome.
So again, I've got others, but those would be the 3. Certainly, in my early career, the first 2 really helped me with information and what have you. So
awesome. And then, do you have a favorite saying or go-to statement?
I have several, as you know, but let's go with perfection is unattainable. But if you strive for perfection, you might catch excellence along the way.
Awesome. That's a great one. It's a great one. Old time, but it's a great one. And then favorite drill that you run.
You of all people know what I'm going to say first, but I've got 2. Shell drill is obviously my favorite drill, so that will make you smile. And then again, alluding back to my birth, if you like, back to Snow Valley basketball camp, a drill called cutthroat, which a lot of people know now, but I brought it to this country from Snow Valley, and that has many attributes. You've seen it in action, and it's a great drill.
Yeah, it's absolutely a great drill, and I actually run the version out of shell drill, a 4v4v4 shell drill, which is a Greg Popovich drill, which he learned from Snow Valley in kind of discrete way. I don't know how, but it's based on cutthroat, and that's he claims it, and so do all the coaches that use it down there. So that's an unbelievable story.
Awesome.
Coach, I mean, as with all of our legend guests, especially, We could go for 3 or 4 hours. We've cut major chunks of your coaching career out. We've kept many stories out. But you know, the information, the knowledge, the people that you've interacted with have been incredible. And not only that, it's been, you know, an inspiration for a whole series of players and coaches in this country, not more so than anyone else other than myself. I appreciate that, you know, everything you've done for me, but, you know, I'm talking for a lot of other people. You've been someone that's been there for the forefront of British basketball coaching. And I want to thank you for being on the Pick and Pop podcast today.
Thank you very much, Coach. And I love you like a brother. Appreciate everything you're doing. This is a great series, and long may it continue.
Thank you, Coach.